Okay, so again, welcome to Rail Families United, where we build strong ties through some very hard truths. I'm calling this second extra video Finance 101 for New Railroaders and the Iron Curtain no one tells you about. This video is going to address a few issues that, man, if somebody had only told me when I was new to the industry, I would have done things so differently. So these are just a few things that I want to share with you. They're critical, and it's just not stuff you're going to learn in the book. So come along for the ride, and I hope you find this video helpful also. Okay, I'm pretty sure I've told people that my background, I have a master's in finance. And so these are issues that, um, again, if only you knew before you joined the rail industry or when you were very new to the rail industry, these are issues that may make you do things quite differently if only you knew. So the first thing is, of course, the excitement of getting hired by one of these class 1 rail carriers. You're feeling like you finally got your big break, your big job. You're going to be making a fantastic salary once you get through the training period and the probation. Well, folks, the big dream that is so often sold often becomes a total nightmare for a lot of families. And even in your training classes, at least for my child, the trainers would tell them, most of you won't even make it. You're not going to be here in a year. Out of my child's class, my child is the only one left. There are some classes where all the trainees are no longer with the company. And when you consider, issues of fake qualifications, I think we're going to see here, in my opinion, why that may be. But don't think that because you've got the big job and you're looking forward, you're excited, you're thinking things are finally breaking for me financially and for my family. Don't be deceived by that. That is the number one thing I have to tell you. Don't be disillusioned. The second thing is debt is death. Again, I'm an MA in finance, and I'll tell you, if you go and you get hired by one of these rail carriers and you think, okay, I can finally buy that nice new truck or new vehicle I need, I can get a mortgage, whatever, because I'm just going to get through this training program and then I'm going to be set for life. And that's the attitude that a lot of people have when they join the rail industry. And again, the dream often, for the most part, probably for 95% of people, can become, and more than that, for more than 95%, given the retention rate, um, it can become a total nightmare for you and your family if you have, a spouse and children to support. So it's extremely, extremely important that you understand the severity of these issues because there's so many things that play into this. If you get into debt, well, what if you lose your job within a year, as most trainees do? What if that happens? What are you going to do if you're now saddled with all this debt? And, you may have no choice but to declare bankruptcy. So, my advice to you, um, as a new railroader, would be live as cheap as you can possibly live. You know, there's the whole issue of relocation of your family members. You seriously want to consider whether or not you want to relocate your entire family if there's a chance you may not even have this job in a year. And folks, don't think, well, I'm going to be the one that makes it through. I'm telling you, the bulk of trainees, the big, big majority, if your class is 30 people in your immediate class and there are several classes going on at once, you're lucky if you have one person that survives in that class. And within a year, they may all be gone. Within 2 years, very likely all will be gone. So do you want to saddle yourself with a mortgage and with, debt of a car, whatever? Do you want to relocate your family before you really know the hard truths that happen in the rail industry when it comes to frontline rail workers and how this industry seems to operate, in my humble opinion? Okay, so those are big, big issues to consider. Then the fact is that trainees are put through very long and very hard shifts for about 4 to 6 months while they are considered trainees. So, you basically eat, sleep, go to work, eat, sleep, go to work. The rest rules may have changed a little bit, but I'm telling you, it's kind of like being a newly trained person in a hospital. When you just graduate from medical school and you're doing what's called your residency in a hospital, you could be doing hundreds of hours, over 100, 120 hours a week when you're a resident in a hospital. You're cheap labor. And it's the same thing in the rail industry. You're very cheap labor. So your shifts are long, and do you really want to put your family through that? I can't emphasize enough, live as cheaply as you can. If you have to live with other rail workers, get a cheap apartment, whatever. Do not get into debt. Because the other issue with getting into debt is that, if they know you've got a lot of debt, they're holding that over your head. And I'll give you a very specific example here. When my child was very near being done the training period and was approaching the field test for being qualified as a conductor, at that time, I had bought a Toyota 4Runner for my child. It was used, but still a good truck, and drove it out west in Canada to give it to my child, and so that they would have a vehicle to go to work, because they didn't have a vehicle at the time. Well, when I bought the vehicle, it was used. I paid for it in cash. It was all paid. There was no financing of that vehicle. It had cost, I think $12,000 at the time. This was, I think, oh my gosh, it was years ago. It was well over 10 years ago. But anyways, so I bring this vehicle out there. It was fully paid. And when my child was asking their supervisor, well, when am I going to get my qualifying test so that I can become a fully qualified conductor? Because your salary almost doubles overnight when you become a qualified conductor. And so, of course, everybody wants to be that qualified conductor so they can make more money and get on with their life and, pay for, the new vehicle they may want, the new house they may have, whatever. People want to be able to move on in life, and that's a natural desire, to have those hopes. But in the case of my child, when I had bought that truck and drove it out, the supervising train master at the time was about, I would say, 4 hours away from where my child was working at that particular time, doing different shifts in different locations in that particular area. And when my child asked the train master, well, when am I going to get qualified and whatever, the answer basically was, well, it's kind of hard to qualify you when you don't have a vehicle to get to the different work locations. To which my child responded, well, I have a truck. And the supervisor said, you have a truck? And it was like this huge surprise. Well, he ended up driving that 4 hours to where my child was working to actually go see if my child had a truck. He couldn't believe it. And my child was so surprised when he was there. And when they had come home that night to their apartment, I'm being told what had happened here during the day and how my child couldn't believe that this guy had driven all the way 4 hours one way to come and see whether or not my child actually had a truck in order to, then be qualified and whatever. So here's the issue. When you get in debt and you need to finance a vehicle, a bank would have to call your employer to verify employment, that you're actually getting a paycheck, that you're going to be able to pay this money back. So that was the issue. This guy, well, at least in my opinion, and I'm telling you, I'm an MA in finance, and when somebody drives that far just to come and verify that you have a truck, there's something wrong with that. And so, the warning bells and flags go up for me as a person in finance, because when something doesn't look quite right, there's something fishy going on here. Follow the money, honey. What's going on? Follow the money. So in that case, the follow the money was that person, that train master, had not received a call from a bank to confirm the employment of my child, because there was no debt on that vehicle. And so he didn't believe that my child, who was just a trainee, could have bought a truck. So I had to go verify for myself whether or not this truck existed, right? When you have debt, they can hold that over your head. And that means they can force you to do things that maybe you shouldn't be doing, like working alone as a trainee when you're not supposed to be working alone according to the Railway Employee Qualification Standards regulation. You are not allowed to work in an occupational category for which you have not qualified, meaning gone through the entire program, done your field tests, and been said to have been qualified, that you passed everything. So if you have debt and they tell you, well, go do this, go do that, and it's a violation of the law, well, it's a lot easier to kind of hint that, if you don't do this, you're going to get in trouble, and just do it. And if you've got a mountain of debt sitting on your shoulders, and if you have a family depending on you, that is an absolutely huge issue. So avoid debt. I cannot tell you that enough. As a new railroader, don't get into debt. It'll help not only with your family's finances and your finances if you're alone, but it will also help with preventing the forcing of you doing things that are quite frankly illegal, like working alone and not being able to push back and say, wait, I'm not supposed to work alone. That's against the law. Okay, so there's that issue. But even after you are qualified, you're then, per the union, on probation for 6 months. So you go through your qualification test, you have qualified, but now you're on probation. Okay, so your salary has increased, almost doubled once you become qualified, but you're still on probation. So you're still subject to being dismissed as really not fit. This is not the perfect fit for you, this job. We don't think that you're doing well enough based on what you've been doing in the field. Well, is that the real issue, or might it be something else? Okay, so a few more hard truths as far as the rail industry is concerned. For matters pertaining to finance, anyways, for new railroaders. Trainees, they're often fired right around the time of the end of the probation period. So you have to ask yourself, why is it that so many trainees end up leaving the company? And why are so many of them fired or told you're not working out, it's time for you to go. And that again is right around the end of your probation period, which I think lasts about 6 months after you have qualified. Well, okay, while you were a trainee, you were that cheap labor. You had half the cost basically of a regular employee. When you start counting, the number of vacation, the amount of vacation you have, how many weeks, you start counting the benefits, your pension, all of the stuff that you have as a brand new trainee versus a guy who's been there for much longer. A more experienced employee is a lot more costly to the company than a newly qualified trainee or someone who's still on probation, etc. So, what do I think is happening based on what I've been researching and the follow the money issue? Well, if you bring in hundreds of trainees and potentially thousands, let's say, over a year, and you go through all of this training process, and then you end up losing a lot of these employees that are newly qualified or right at the end of their probation period. Again, you're pretty cheap as an employee when you're new to the company. So, even when I worked in corporate America along with my husband, and he's also an MA in finance, he was outright told and he worked very high level positions and stuff, and worked with VPs and whatever all the time in a Global 100 company. And he was basically told by one of these VPs, the new mentality now is to bring him in, burn him, and churn them. So you bring them in, you work them to death, and he had been told within 5 years, get rid of them. So there's basically no loyalty to employees anymore. You're just there to be a warm body, to move the equipment, move the goods, do whatever your boss is telling you to do, and forget about thinking you're going to be here for 20, 30 years and get a nice pension. That is no longer the attitude today in corporations. There's really no loyalty to employees. And the quicker you realize that, the better. Now, that would have a lot of implications for how things are done in the rail industry, if that's indeed what might be going on. Another thing that people need to be aware of, when you're a new rail worker, everything in the rail industry for frontline rail workers, it's all based on seniority, whatever. And so a lot of times, if they don't outright fire you, another way that they can potentially easily get rid of you is to lay you off. And so you see massive layoffs in the rail industry where you could be laid off, as a newly qualified person, even if you finished your probation and everything, and you think, okay, things are finally going to work out. I got my bigger salary now. I can get the mortgage. I can get the new vehicle. Don't do that. Give it more time. Because another way to get rid of employees, if you want to churn and burn, is to lay them off. And you could be laid off for months at a time. And so, again, be aware of these issues, because there's a lot of tricks, in my opinion, that are being played in order to get rid of newly qualified employees. And, and I'm going to tell you why I think that's the case. Because it always, comes down to money, in my humble opinion. When my child first joined the rail industry, I remember I was starting to read message boards where rail workers were posting messages to kind of start to understand some of the issues and stuff. And there is one message that stuck with me forever. And it was an employee saying, I've never seen a company, this is not a direct paraphrase, but this is or a direct quote, but it was basically the gist of what he was saying was, I've never seen a company spend so much time and so much money on training its employees only to then try so hard to get rid of them. Well, and I remember my child told me, by the time you become a fully qualified conductor, they may have spent 150,000 on you, training you and everything. And, that seems, yeah, like an awful lot of money. But what if that's not really what's happening? And again, follow the money, honey. Um, when I see that employees are being fake qualified, okay, so the company tells us they're spending maybe up to $150,000 on you, training you to become a fully qualified conductor. What if they're not really doing that? Because maybe you're not getting your yard training, as was the case for conductor trainee Jason Clooney. He had a lot of road trips. He had like 57 road trips when you were supposed to have 45 tours, and 15 of those were supposed to be in a yard. But he was always just on the line moving equipment. Why had he not gotten his yard training yet? He had 0 yard training, as was the case for my child. Even well a year after having been qualified, my child had basically 0 yard training per an incident that had happened in that rail yard where my child worked. There was an incident where, and this was a fairly large yard, there was an incident where my child was hanging on to a grain car, and one of the wheels popped off the track because there was too much ice on the track. And technically that's a derailment, right? If the grain would have shifted and the car flipped over, my child would have been killed instantly. But because that's a derailment, well, and my child was new to that terminal, which was pretty big. I mean, it's one of these where you could have hundreds of switches and dozens of trains every day. So the new union rep had to look up my child's file, and by this time they had been newly qualified. They'd probably been with CN for about, I'm going to say 2 to 3 years, okay? I'm going to say at least 2 years. So when this incident happened and the wheel popped off the track, the new union rep looks up my child's record to see if they had ever been involved in any other incident. And then that person came up to my child and said, okay, how many yard shifts do you need to be a qualified conductor? So my child told them how many shifts you need for the training program, and I think it was 15. And then this union rep says, how many do you have? Kind of a funny thing to be asking, but my child had been led to believe they were fully qualified, right? Well, my child tells them how many shifts and said, I have at least that many because I worked at this other location for months. And the answer from the union rep was, no, that's just considered a switcher location. You have 0. So my child was allowed to go from a very small rail yard with 2 or 3 switches, 2 or 3 trains per day, to one on the main line with dozens of trains, potentially hundreds of switches, hundreds of employees working out of this other terminal with 0 yard training, putting not only my child, but everyone else in that terminal at risk. So that's what I refer to as fake qualified. And if my child had been fake qualified, that meant all these other workers working at all these little locations, if they weren't one of the 12 or so actual rail yards like Winnipeg or Montreal or Edmonton, which are the big rail yards, considered the rail yards, where you get all of the type of yard training for point protection zones, signal, it's not occupancy controlled systems, it's actual rail traffic controllers, whatever. So there's a lot of training you can only get in an actual rail yard. So these people, trainees are led to believe that they're qualified when, in my opinion, the facts show they've been fake qualified. And that was absolutely, what the Mac Yard incident outside of Toronto for a CN rail yard had also shown, as far back as 2007, that they were fake qualifying workers that far back. And so, when I see, okay, that's what they were doing in 2007, and we're going to go through that incident because it's just too revealing. But if they were doing that back in 2007, and knowing what I knew, that conductor trainee Jason Clooney had 0 yard training when he died, even though he had lots of tours, he had 57 trips, he was only supposed to have 45 to be qualified, and 15 of those were supposed to be in a yard. So why always just on the line, right? And why did my child not have yard training? Well, if you're planning on getting rid of people and you're going to do everything you possibly can, in my humble opinion, to get rid of these employees, because you want to burn and churn and, bring in a bunch of employees, hundreds of them at a time, use them as cheap labor, so what if you fake qualify them? Get rid of them. Who's going to know any better? Right? Right. In my opinion, that's absolutely what is happening in the rail industry. And that's my opinion. You're entitled to your own. But based on what I've seen, what I know, that's, follow the money, honey. So why would you be, getting rid of employees that you supposedly spent $150,000 to train as qualified conductors? Why would you be doing that? Why wouldn't you give them a little bit of extra training if they just need a little bit of extra training? You're not going to tell me that all these people are just not working out, that 100%, or 98% of every class that gets trained just doesn't work out. I don't believe it. I mean, I'm just not that naive anymore. And again, that would absolutely explain the fake qualification of frontline rail workers. Because again, who's going to know the difference? You bring them in, you work them to death, you churn them, burn them, bring in another group, do the same thing. They're a lot cheaper than regular employees. So churn them, burn them, get rid of them, churn them, burn them, get rid of them, and the cycle just keeps going, making the rail industry exponentially more dangerous as the older employees keep retiring, and there's not that many new ones coming in who are given the opportunity to stay with the company, because either you outright fire them or you lay them off for so long and they may be in debt, and so they have to end up taking a job somewhere else and quitting with the rail carrier because they have to support their families. So, folks, these are not easy things to have to say, but in my opinion, it's absolutely what is going on. And I think that if you did a compliance audit to look at, training programs and qualification and yard trips, and you did a really in-depth analysis of all these employees who were brought in over the years and let go. Again, why would you let all these employees go if you had really spent that much money training them? If you're fake qualifying them and giving them half the training maybe that they're supposed to get, well, you're not spending $150,000 as you would say that you are. You're probably spending a lot less. And given that employee is a lot cheaper to have because they're a trainee or they're newly qualified, again, you're saving a ton of money. So Are you really spending 75,000 even? You're not spending the 150,000. Are you spending half of that, 75,000, when there's that counterbalance that the employee is a lot cheaper to start with? So it's a big gain there, you know? And there's another issue, and that is the fact that a lot of rail carriers own hotels. And we're going to get into that issue too. But you know, if I do my training sessions, the classroom training at the hotels that the rail carrier owns, or is, you know, maybe owns half of the hotel or whatever, as was the case for my child. Well, if CN owns a hotel or CP owned the hotel, I can get some pretty good occupancy at my hotels if I'm constantly churning the workforce and bringing in new employees and whatever. And when I bring in those employees and they stay in our hotel rooms, you know, you have to ask yourself, is the profit on the balance sheet, is that hotel being given to the new employee coming in for training at cost? Or is that employee being charged the regular hotel rate? So you could be, again, helping balance sheets in the hotel operations for the rail carrier by bringing in all these employees that you burn and churn and burn and churn and fake qualify. So again, folks, I'm an MA in finance. And when I see things such as those that I see going on in the rail industry, follow the money, honey. Look for the links and what is really going on here. Because I think when you start looking at all these issues, maybe you're realizing what's really going on. So just some very hard issues again to have to address, but nobody's going to tell you this stuff. You're not going to learn this in the book, and by the time you realize what's going on, and most employees don't know about being fake qualified. They think they're perfectly qualified. They've been led to believe they've been properly qualified. And then you can move from a smaller terminal, a smaller yard, to a larger yard, and then you get killed or you get injured. And if you look at, you know, injuries in the rail industry, a lot of them seem to happen 2 to 3 years after an employee comes on board with the company. So that would all make perfect sense, because that's when employees might be looking to change terminals. And so they're thinking they're qualified and they move on to another terminal, and then the hard realities hit home, and potentially via an accident or a death. So again, the hard issues, the hard truths that nobody's going to tell you about before it's too late. And so to me, it's just too important not to tell new rail workers and their families about these types of issues. Okay, the final thing that I'm going to mention in this video has to do with what I call the Iron Curtain. And this was not mentioned to my child. And it's something that rips families apart, literally. Because in Canada, at least for CN Rail, I'm not sure about CP, but if you join CP, make sure that you find out whether or not this is the truth for CP also. I'm thinking it might be because it's still the same union, the Teamsters Canada Rail Conference, that represents pretty well all conductors in Canada. But anyway, here's the issue. In Thunder Bay, Ontario, that's basically what I call the Iron Curtain. And by that I mean, if you get hired, and let's say you get hired to go out west. Let's say you live in Ontario, you live east of Thunder Bay, Ontario, okay? And you get hired to go out west. And they'll ask you, do you have a problem with going out west? And my child, said, no, no problem, I'll go out west. And then you're thinking, I can always transfer back, whatever. Well, the problem is that they're in Canada for CN. Again, you'd have to double check for CP or ask this question if you're thinking of joining the rail industry. But there's the east and there's the west. And it's kind of like never shall the two cross. So if you're hired to go out west, okay, west is from British Columbia all the way to Thunder Bay, Ontario. East goes from Thunder Bay out to, as far as CN would go for their rail lines out east. But to go from one to the other is almost impossible. You would lose all your seniority and have to restart all your seniority in order to cross the Iron Curtain into the other territory and come back to where your family may be. Like a lot of people, like my child, was thinking, okay, I'll go out west for a year or two and then I'll cross back to the east area, not knowing that there was that Iron Curtain that existed at Thunder Bay, Ontario. And that if you wanted to cross that Iron Curtain, you basically had to restart from scratch. It was almost like you lost all your seniority. And so you'd have to restart with the worst shifts, in the new rail yard, whatever. You'd be at the bottom of the totem pole again. And so, again, just one of these hard issues that you need to be aware of. With the tariffs coming in with Donald Trump and stuff, and Canada looking at getting rid of interprovincial trade barriers, I don't know if that's going to apply to rail workers because they're under that union contract. And so I'm kind of thinking not. And I'm kind of thinking that those barriers will still be there, that if you're hired from the West, you will stay in the West. If you're hired for the East, you will stay in the East, or else lose all your seniority and start over if you want to cross over. So again, just another issue to be aware of, because it does absolutely, this is one that literally, physically separates families for a very long time. And if there is an issue that my family has found extremely difficult, it is also this one, because we really wanted our child to come back out east and, work out here. And that just has not happened. And it will likely not happen, because to have to lose your seniority and basically start over at the bottom of the totem pole because you decide to go back home, it's just almost impossible to do. Okay, so I'm going to stop this video here, and again, like, share, subscribe, and if you are subscribed, make sure that you remain subscribed. And I hope you're enjoying these extras that I've decided to provide, and I will see you on the next one. So have a great day.